So, well, let's, comments or questions, please make them brief. We only have 15 minutes. Yes?
Thanks for the poetry.
Oh,
Historically
oh,
referenced. No,
you're welcome.
Me? Thank you for the talk. It's
Yeah.
beautiful to listen to, but I think you presented an essentially bourgeois, liberal bourgeois view of Cuban Revolution.
I wish I could agree with you. Nothing would please me more to accept that such a criticism, but I have to, with all due respect, decline the offer and the view, because the views that I'm expressing here are a faithful reflection of 50 years of deep conversation with Cubans who have fought to make that revolution, and the labels do not adequately describe the more complicated and contradictory reality that is the nature of that authentic revolutionary. And it's incumbent upon all honest observers not to themselves be imprisoned in the carapace of prejudices inherited from the past, which is why I make the observation that to understand a revolution, one must always try to pierce the battle of cliches. Condemning it as, and this view as liberal or bourgeois, advances neither understanding nor significant apprehension of the reality that we have inherited from these past 60 years of sacrifice and revolution.
Thank you. Very good.
Thanks for the excellent presentation. It's one of the best I've heard here. I spent a month in Cuba, and I was really impressed. I didn't see any homeless.
No, none.
I heard of hardly any crime. Just, it was great in every way. But I heard you say that, you know, maybe one criticism you had was that Castro stayed in power too long. But I don't know, you know, do you have any personal criticisms or about Castro in Cuba? I mean, I hope you don't, but.
I think I tried to make those criticisms as implicit and as explicit as I could. Those criticisms, however, are anchored in a deep dive into the history of the place. But I do share the rather widespread feeling among many Cubans who helped to make the revolution, that his achievement was so large, the shadow cast so long, and his perch atop the power structure of Cuba was responsible in some considerable measure, not for the maturation of the political process, but rather its enfeeblement after a certain point. And I think that is a serious criticism, despite which has to be weighed against his enormous achievement. I tried to present in this talk what I hope was a balanced portrait of strengths and weaknesses. But to have only concentrated on the strengths and to ignore the weaknesses would have been as lopsided as to have only concentrated on the weaknesses and not acknowledged the strengths. All revolutions, all human beings are three-dimensional personalities, and I regard Castro as an exceptional human being, but not as a saint.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you.
Can I just make a comment briefly, and that is that I mean, Steve and I have been friends and we've been dialoguing about this for a long time, and we have differences of opinion, and I think that's right. We have, and that's what, and I think all of us have our own views, and I think it's really, really important that we try to really grapple with what Steve has talked about, and that, so I think that it's really, really important that there be a deeper understanding of what happened in Cuba, and that part of that's going to be tied to digging and working and thinking. So I just want to make that comment. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to say, I've been to Cuba 5 times, and the last time I was there was maybe 3 years ago, I think. And what I kept hearing from people, this was in Havana, Vieja, and what I kept hearing from people, oh, I'm tired of the triumph of the revolution. and talking to people and say, oh, look at these buildings, like on the Malacone, built by the Russians. They have two windows on the Malacone. And so I heard a lot of this negativity, and I thought, I haven't been able to bring myself back there again since then. Although I know I need to go because there is a love for Cuba. You get, I mean, you know, I would get feelings of needing to be there, and then I would find how I could get there. And the one famous little market, I took my little granddaughter, who was 2.5, to Cuba. And she said, I was walking on the Malacone and I fell down in a puddle of water and I didn't even get cold. There was that.
Yeah. I worked on, when I was 23, I edited film on Fidel Castro with Saul Lando and
Yes.
Irving Ceref.
Yes, I know
Yeah,
the film.
and so I edited all Fidel's speeches. And one of the things I noticed that was really amazing was that he was able to incur lightning behind him. You know, I mean, I was a film, you know, I'd just gotten out of UCLA Film School, et cetera. But I mean, you know, I mean, I was very, you know, cognizant of lighting and things. And you know, I mean, there was like lightning that came down from the heavens, you know, as he was speaking at the podium.
Well, one of the most iconic images, he gets to Havana, and there at the old headquarters of the camp, he's delivering a speech. Camilo is standing next to him. I mean, a Hollywood set designer could not have orchestrated this in the way, and the photographs caught it as he's speaking. This is 5 days after Batista flees. It's nighttime. The lights are on him, and two doves come and perch on his shoulder, which many Cubans, believing, you know, Santeros, you know, and so they took as a sign of his anointment from the heavens above. And the doves are perched on his shoulder. The photograph exists of it. And Camilo, he turns to Camilo and says, "How am I doing?" You know, when you think about the struggle that was waged, it is hard not to, in fact, it's irresistible. It is so moving, so extraordinary. They're so bloody lucky at almost every turn, despite all the hardships. I mean, that the 2 years was like nothing in the course of a guerrilla war. I mean, you know, and even Fidel said much later that he thought their victory was only made possible because the worldwide forces that are arrayed, the Soviet Union being present, the United States being distracted, technologies being what they were. It's not at all clear that in today's world, with facial surveillance and all kinds of stuff, that they would have been as successful as they were at concealing their whereabouts. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, forces. On the other hand, the Taliban has fought a 17-year war to a standstill and soon a victory, no matter whatever you think of them. You know, American troops will one day, rather sooner than later, have to withdraw from a place that they are, which is not their home, 10,000 miles away, and those people will have to settle their own history, despite the meddling of great powers. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
what your impression about the new leadership of Cuba? And the new guy, whose name I can't remember.
Miguel Diaz-Canel.
Yeah.
Miguel Diaz.
Who sort of projects himself as the anti-charismatic person. That's my impression. I wonder what your impression and the people you talk to.
The short answer: too early to tell.
And his last name is Miguel.
Diaz-Canel.
Diaz-Canel. Too early to tell, but he's making great efforts to show up and concern himself with other things, and to try to break down the impression of a colorless bureaucrat that he is an impression. Nobody can fill Castro's shoes. I mean, there's just no question of that. There are many, many challenges ahead of them. I will say that the popular power, the two vice presidents of Cuba are of African heritage. There are more women now in power throughout the country. But the jury is out. He is certainly being tested now because the United States has launched, for all intents and purposes, a war. Really, I mean, the economic aggression, all these efforts amount to an almost undeclared war, but it's all but been declared. I mean, it's really quite, and very many Cubans do think the recent efforts by the Trump administration to throttle Cuba have plunged the country into the gravest existential crisis since the height of the Cold War.
Due to Trump.
Yes.
Well, this is a lovely presentation. I'm not an academic, so I can't quite argue back.
Well, I'm not an academic either, so you're welcome to try.
Well, I'm just saying, you have a lot of comments in there that could well do with research, and I don't have any of it. What we have here, and I don't know, I'd like to hear what Raj was talking about when he made his comment. We have a group of people here who study Stalin according to Grover Furr. You're familiar with
Yes.
Grover? Yeah. So I'm interested in what you have to say, if anything, about why you called some bad behavior Stalinist, because as far as I know, Stalin was a great defender of the revolution, and that's what's being supported by the research that Grover Furr is now doing, showing that these charges against him were not substantial, that they were being made up by countering forces.
Right. I think it's a good question, but it's deserving of a more complete
Right, and I'd like you to do
style.
that.
But
I'd like you-
I'm not going to do it in a haiku,
Right.
given the time that we have.
I
But
wanted
I'm
to-
quite willing to have that thing. Let's just put it this way, that research represents significant but minority view, and that it's certainly reasonable people might reasonably come to differing conclusions on Stalin's reign.
Right, I wanted
Okay,
to bring it
I
up as a
think we
conversation.
should probably wind this up. I really want to just say this in conclusion. I want to thank Steve for coming. I also really very much appreciate the turnout, and that please let's keep moving. When we think about Cuba, we can think of this long presentation that Steve gave, which with much information, deep insight. But we can also think of it as a way forward to discuss and defend the Cuban revolutionary process. And that what we need to do, that's one of the most important tasks that we have as progressives, as revolutionaries, whatever, in the United States. The presence of the Cuban Revolution continues. And now with these new attacks, and regardless of what we think about this or that in Cuba, we have to defend that process. And that we need to be deeply involved. So I urge people to go to Cuba, to defend it, to learn about it, to read about it. There are many books that have been written. We can have more forums. I'm very honored to have done this today. As I said earlier, Steve is one of my oldest friends. So I very much want to thank you all for coming. And let's continue to defend the Cuban Revolution. Thank you.
People want to say